book, dude.
But since we have to be out by 8:30, if we let him go, then.
Well,
All right, thank you very much.
Also, for those of you who are new, we usually do grab food afterwards.
Yes. Okay, I'm talking about the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. My talk is based on the Little Ice Age by Brian Fagan. So if everybody would like to take a look at this book, if you want to look at it. The general idea is historical ecology. It's the general idea that not only has man influenced the ecology, but the ecology has had a huge influence on man and man's history. And one really significant event was the change from the medieval warm period to what's called the Little Ice Age. The medieval warm period is roughly 800 to 1300 AD, and that warmest period, called the medieval maximum, was 1100 to 1250 AD. And if you think about those dates, that was the days that the Vikings were settling Greenland and Iceland. And they were able to do that because it was warmer. The Little Ice Age kicks off around 1300 and runs all the way to 1850. You can think of the other end being Charles Dickens' snowy English times. The height, there were two maximums of the Little Ice Age, from about 1570 to 1600, which would have been Elizabethan era, and the Thames River froze over on a regular basis, so that they had street fairs on the ice. That's how thick it froze over. And then, of course, the other maximum was 1810 to about 1820, which was Dickens was born in 1812, and that's sort of what he was talking about when he was writing about his childhood. To get an idea, when I just throw out here numbers, the medieval warm period was 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than modern times. That's the average temperature. And the Little Ice Age was anywhere from 1 to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit colder than modern times. To give you an idea, that would mean shorter, cooler summers and longer, colder winters. If you think about it, if Raleigh, North Carolina was, we take this as the modern norm, the medieval warm period would be like going down to Savannah, Georgia, which is kind of subtropical. Their summers are a little bit longer, not that much warmer. Their winters a little bit milder, a little bit shorter. Not a huge significant change. But the move from the medieval warm period, and this happened from maximum was 1250 to 1570, in about 350 years, would be like moving from Savannah, Georgia to New York, New York. That's a drastic change. They have much, much, much colder. You're going from subtropical to very, very cold. And what they think happened is we have the Gulf Stream that comes up our coast, carries all the heat over to Europe and dumps it onto England and dumps it onto Europe. And there, in fact, is a island off the southwest coast of England that is almost tropical. That's how much heat gets dumped by the Gulf Stream. And for whatever reason, the Gulf Stream shut down, and as that heat went away, England got colder. The coldness had a lot of effects on the history of Europe, that change. And if you think about it, about everything from the differences from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance is being a cold adaptation, adapting to the colder weather, it all sorts of makes sense. The most obvious change is in clothing. Because if you think about clothing in the Middle Ages, the loose open tunics that the Vikings wore, cloaks, they had a lot more loose clothing. They might be layered. They had open sandals, open boots, things like that. And by the Renaissance, they're buttoning up. They're putting heavier layers on. It's cold. You think about the heavy Elizabethan gowns with the multi-layers, and you're wearing them around here in the summer, and you're dying because they're so hot. Well, and you wondered how they could survive in this. Well, it was a lot colder. That's why up in Northern Kingdom, in the East Kingdom, they do a lot more Renaissance garb, because garb appropriate. And we do a lot more Norse, Celtic, Viking down here because garb appropriate. The second big significant change was in housing and shelter. A lot of the housing in the Middle Ages, you think about the open, long pits with the central fires, the drafty castles. You had manors and villages in a feudalistic type arrangement. And as you go into the Renaissance, you start seeing chimneys. Now, chimneys existed, it's just that the amount of cost and labor that went into building the chimney didn't really yield you a lot when it didn't get that cold. The central fire pit worked. As it got colder, chimneys are a lot more efficient in heating. So you had a lot more chimneys come in. Manor houses started having glass show up. Because before it was expensive, not a lot of benefit. You could just put some sheepskin. But as it got colder, glass was more efficient insulator, and so the value of the glass might be expensive, but the return on it was a lot higher. And you had the rise of town and a capitalistic society, and this happened because the population crashed between the two. And the population crashed because you had a change in food and food production. You went from a uniform crop of bread and wine throughout most of Europe, because bread, being a wheat crop, could grow pretty much all through Europe. Everybody drank wine. England was noted for its vineyards and its wine villages. If you ever think about the Middle Ages, everybody seems to be drinking wine. If you ever think about the Renaissance, everybody in Northern Europe is drinking beer. And everybody in Southern Europe, Italy and lower France, is still drinking wine, because they weren't as severely affected by the Little Ice Age. And grapes were expatriated from England, and they just started reintroducing grapes to England in the last 20 years. So it's now finally warmed up enough that they can bring grapes back to England. That's why all of Northern Europe are beer drinkers, because grapevines couldn't grow up in Northern Europe when it got colder. That's why we drink beer in this country, and wine is for the effete snobs, because wine we're a mostly Northern European country. Wine going into Northern Europe was an expensive, it went from being what you grew out back to being an expensive import. And so we drink beer, and wine is fancy stuff. The food production in the Middle Ages was, you had the longer growing season, you had more cultivatable land because you could go further up in altitude, you had a more stable weather, you had more predictable crop yields, more predictable crop yields. Thus, in the Middle Ages, you had a surplus population. Labor was cheap, people were cheap. Feudalism thrived on cheap labor and cheap people. You also had the cheap labor and cheap people to build things like cathedrals and large public things. There were no cathedrals built in the Renaissance. They finished some cathedrals in the Renaissance. They did not start any, did not build any. They only finished them because they didn't have the labor anymore. Because you go into the Renaissance as it gets colder, and you end up with shorter growing seasons, a reduction in cultivatable land, which is why the Vikings were slowly shoved out of Greenland and Iceland. It was why the whole Viking Norse collapsed, because they went to Viking because they had a surplus population in the Middle Ages. It was warm, the North Atlantic was stable, their open boat design could sail safely on the North Atlantic. As it got colder, the North Atlantic got stormier, their open boats were swamped, and closed boats were the ones that were able to tackle the North Atlantic. The people who had closed boats were the English and the Portuguese, who were the two greatest navies in the Renaissance. They already had the closed boat designs. So the whole Norse Viking civilization kind of collapsed on the rise of population. You had glacial advancement. They actually would go out and have religious services trying to stop the glacier from advancing on their city or town. And when it failed in the religious service to stop the glacier, you had kind of a religious collapse in faith, maybe a little bit. And you had, in the Renaissance, a rise in other ways of looking at things, which was the occult that we've talked about before in the Renaissance, and also science. was a little bit more because religion wasn't exactly holding back the glaciers anymore.